From the Historyogi podcast, this is Dave. From the 1950s to the 1970s, no Chinese community in Southeast Asia was more vigilant in identifying and rooting out suspected communists and committed to mobilizing against the People's Republic of China as the Philippine Chinese. Today, we speak to Assistant Professor Chien-Wen from the National University of Singapore about his new book, Diasporic Cold Warriors. He argues for a network and transnational understanding of the ROC-KMT party state and demonstrates that Taipei exercised a form of non-territorial sovereignty over the Philippine Chinese with Manila's participation and consent. Okay, thanks so much, Chien-Wen, for joining me today. To start off, what prompted you to study the Philippine Chinese and their links to the KMT?
Thank you very much, Dev, for having me. I'm delighted to be here to talk about my book and my research. I entered graduate school with the goal of studying sort of transnational right-wing nationalist networks in Asia. I was interested in an organization called the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, which in fact does make a cameo appearance in one of the chapters of my book. But as I read more primary material, it became obvious fairly quickly that the Taiwanese, or I should say the ROC state and KMT officials were saying a lot of things about the Philippine Chinese. Opening sentences of my book make clear they were very enthusiastic about the Chinese in the Philippines. And so one thing led to another. And before you knew it, I was writing a dissertation on the KMT in the Philippines, among the Philippine Chinese, and efforts by the regime and the party state to mobilize the Chinese in the Philippines especially during the Cold War era. And so that's how I got interested in the topic. It helped that I was able to identify primary sources in Taiwan, for example, that I could use to write this dissertation, which eventually became a book. And it helped that even though people at the time were making a big deal of the Philippine Chinese as the most enthusiastic supporters of going down, there was no secondary scholarship. Right? There was virtually no secondary scholarship, at least written within the last couple of decades, certainly, that addressed this.
To set the scene, how was KMT influence like in the colonial era in the Philippines before the Second World War?
Sure. So that's the subject of chapter 1 of the book, which sort of lays out a key argument of the book, which is that the KMT has to be understood sort of transnationally as a diasporic network institution, rather than simply the party state, which happened to be in mainland China until 1949, and then in Taiwan after 1949. And so in the first chapter of the book, right, I explain what things were like before 1945. The book focuses on the post-1945 period, but it was important that I provided some deeper history to the core chapters of the book. And I do so in chapter 1, right, by pointing out how the KMT established itself, right, in the Philippines, much among the Chinese community there, among a relatively small Chinese community there, right, and this was something that the KMT did pretty much throughout Southeast Asia during the pre-war period, and other parts of the world as well, right, where they happen to be sort of Chinese migrant communities. Unlike after the 1950s, right, unlike from 1950s onwards, a period during which KMT influence in the Philippines was virtually unchallenged. The pre-war period, right, the period from about the 1930s all the way up to 1941, right, and the outbreak of the Pacific War, that was a period of considerable tensions between the KMT on the one hand and what I call the Chinese left, individuals and movements with ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and whom the KMT quickly found itself in conflict with, right? And so this conflict was particularly intense in schools, right? Within schools, and I talk a little bit about that in chapter 1, and also within sort of the broadly defined Chinese labor movement. But what's important, the important thing here is that the KMT was by no means a hegemonic movement among the Philippine Chinese prior to 1945, right, and prior to 1950, as we'll see, right. For example, the chief leadership institutions of the Philippine Chinese community, namely the Manila General Chinese Chamber of Commerce, were not at this point in time before the war, were not at this point in time full of sort of hardcore KMT supporters. The institution, these chambers of commerce tended to be fairly conservative in a small c sense, and the leaders of these institutions tended to view themselves as above politics, or should I say, less than passionate about sort of the politics of the Chinese mainland, right? And so the KMT activists in the Philippines at this point in time, a lot of them tended to be a lot of them came, well, virtually all of them came from China itself. A lot of them had undergone intelligence training or intelligence with sort of paramilitary training in ways that made them highly ideological and very much committed to advancing the KMT's particular set of revolutionary ideals, which so happened to bring the KMT in conflict with what it called the other party, that is to say, sort of the Chinese left. So that's the political / ideological landscape that I sketch in the first chapter of the book.
With the resumption of the Chinese Civil War after 1945, how did this bloody struggle affect the Philippine Chinese?
Right. So now we're moving on to the second chapter of my book. The term bloody struggle doesn't actually refer to the civil war that was unfolding in China. The term bloody struggle or 血斗时期 is actually a term that the KMT itself used. I've only found one specific reference to this term, but it's a term that the KMT uses in 1952, right, after the bloody struggle is over, right, to refer to a specific period from 1945 to 1950. Within those 5 years, there's a specific period in the Philippines, that the KMT refers to as its bloody struggle against the Chinese left. What happens after the war is that, just like in China itself, and just like pretty much everywhere else in the world, is that the kinds of political coalitions that were formed during the war, the kinds of marriages of convenience between left-wing anti-fascist forces and more conservative, more nationalist, anti-fascist forces, the political coalitions that were forming in the war unravel, and more often than not, the communists end up on the losing side, right? Obviously, the example that we're most familiar with is Malaya. So obviously, Malaya, the events in Malaya are on a much larger scale, given the size of the Chinese populations in these two countries. But something similar unfolds in the Philippines, right? That no sooner has Manila been liberated than the tenuous contingent marriage of convenience between left and right-wing Chinese factions, both of whom had formed anti-Japanese guerrilla movements during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, they start coming to blows with each other. This is a little understood period in sort of Philippine Chinese history and in Philippine history more generally. It's hard to find sources on this period. It is clear that this is a very violent period. Many Chinese, because of the sheer numbers of firearms, right, that just happen to be lying around, or which anti-Japanese guerrilla movements happen to have acquired, right, from the Americans, for example, right? And so this is a period during which shootings and assassinations and murders in Chinatown are common, right? This is a period during which persons who happen to be on one side of the other ended up getting either threatened, blackmailed, or even assassinated by partisans from the other side. In the absence of a state, right, of a state authority sufficiently powerful enough to put an end to such extrajudicial killings. These tensions metastasize into something approximating a full-blown conflict between the left and the right within the Chinese community, right? Not only in Manila but in other parts of the Philippines as well. And what happens is that the KMT is able to ally itself, enters into a partnership with sort of Philippine security forces, right, with the Philippine military, in a way that is beneficial to both of them, right, and in a way that's detrimental to the long-term fortunes of the Chinese left. It's not a very large Chinese left-wing movement. It's a movement that had ties to Filipino communists, but relations between Filipino and Chinese communists were full of their own sets of tensions because of sort of differences and because of sort of ethnic differences, right, and differences, perceptions of who should be spearheading the movement. What happens is that the KMT and its partners, right, within the Philippine intelligence forces, the police, the military, are eventually able to put an end to this bloody struggle that we've been talking about, and create an environment that the Chinese left retrospectively referred to as a white terror. So by the end of the 1940s, the Chinese left has the main leaders of the Chinese left, right, many of whom came from China to the Philippines in the 1930s to begin with. Many of these persons had left the Philippines, right? They had left the Philippines for what was a more favorable political climate in China itself, where of course the CCP was on the verge of winning the civil war. And so this sort of highly complex and contingent set of developments is partly what helps lay the foundations for KMT hegemony in the 2 decades that follow.
Anti-communism is a central theme in your book. Who were the main local players in Philippine Chinese anti-communism, and why did the KMT invest so much in influencing the Philippine Chinese?
So there are lots of different sort of factions within what we might describe as the Philippine Chinese anti-communist movement in general, right? So by the mid 1950s, I think it's pretty clear who these factions are. The KMT was able to operate openly in the Philippines, right, and was one of these, obviously a mainstay of this movement. And by KMT here I mean not only sort of local Filipino Chinese KMT members, but also persons, for example, with ties to the ROC state, right? I mean, the point of my book is to argue that these KMT activists were transnational, and moved right between the Philippines, Taiwan, and other parts of this thing that I call the anti-communist ecumene. But see, the movement would not have been as influential and as dominant as it was if not for obviously support from other segments of society, right? It drew upon, for example, the sort of the business community, right, in the Philippines, and some of these persons were staunchly anti-communist, but not necessarily members of the KMT. there were the KMT was entrenched within the school system, within the Chinese school system, right? Which the Philippine state sort of made attempts to regulate, but which was never especially effective at regulating. And I would say that Filipinos was just Filipinos, non-Chinese Filipinos, persons who did not identify themselves as ethnically Chinese in the Philippines, right? Filipinos, especially those in the military and the educational establishment and the intelligence establishment, also played an important role in propagating in it and indeed in enforcing sort of anti-communism within the Chinese community. Right? So this is a community whose leadership by the 1950s was firmly pro-KMT, if not the KMT members themselves. A community which also had the backing, whose anti-communist activities had the backing of the diplomatic establishment, right? The ROC diplomatic establishment, and the sort of the intelligence and security apparatus of the host state, right? The host government. Why did KMT invest so much in influencing the Philippine Chinese? I mean, there are two ways of answering this question, right? One is that, as I mentioned, the ROC, the Republic of China, right, Taiwan, and the KMT was able to operate openly in the Philippines during the Cold War, unlike in other parts of Southeast Asia. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to sort of sketch sort of a broadly comparative context, right, within which to think about the KMT. By the mid-1950s, for example, the KMT has actually been proscribed, right, in Malaya, for example. It's not allowed to operate openly in Malaya, right, and in other parts of Southeast Asia as well, even though other Southeast Asian governments were just as anti-communist as the Philippine government was. So it's this sort of legal / diplomatic framework, and the willingness of the Philippine state to, as I put in the book, to share sovereignty over the Philippine Chinese with the KMT, right, with sort of the Philippine Chinese themselves, that makes the Philippines such a productive space, right, for KMT activities. I mean, another way of looking at the question, of course, is to sort of pull back and think about the KMT's efforts at mobilizing sort of Chinese diasporic communities in general, right? That's something that goes back again to the pre-war period. In fact, it goes all the way back to the KMT's origins in the early 20th century. And this question, we can also answer this question in sort of a more general, not necessarily Philippine-specific sense, arguing that the Kuomintang has always sought to mobilize persons whom it considers to be members of the quote-unquote Chinese nation, right, in support of whatever objectives it happens to prioritize, right? So in the aftermath of the Second World War, again here being sort of the high watermark of overseas Chinese nationalism, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Kuomintang, because it's retreated to Taiwan and finds itself yet again, mired in sort of this in sort of a life or death situation, mired in this existential crisis, right? And having established these networks across the Chinese-speaking world, right, prior to the war, it sort of it tries to leverage these networks in order to pursue what it calls its counterattack, right, against the mainland, right? Its efforts to combat communism and fight Russia, right, which sort of are the Kuomintang's overriding political objectives during this period. And so that's the broader context here. Unfortunately, right, or unfortunately for the KMT, right, it's not all governments are willing to tolerate the KMT's sort of extraterritorial mobilization after 1949, right? It just so happens that the Philippines didn't really care, right? That in fact it welcomed the KMT's intervention in the Chinese community as a way of sort of keeping tabs on the Chinese population there.
You use the Chinese commercial news affair of 1970 to illustrate official collusion against those who disagreed with the KMT's hegemony over the Philippine Chinese. Could you briefly explain its significance and the consequences that resulted?
Sure. So the Chinese commercial affair takes up an entire chapter of the book, right? The final chapter of the book. It's a fascinating and complex affair that I tried to do justice to, but which I couldn't possibly do so within one chapter. So the Chinese commercial news was one of 4 Chinese language broadsheets in the Philippines at the time. Right, it was a centrist and liberal newspaper, which did not toe the KMT party line, and whose editors and writers typically advocated cultural integration, right? Were known for advocating cultural integration into sort of the Filipino nation state. When I say centrist here, I mean that it was the editorial policy, the CCN's editorial policy sort of was to publish news from both sides, on both sides of the China-Taiwan split, the PRC-ROC split. Right? So it will publish, for example, both pro and anti-PRC articles. It will publish stuff from both that reported favorably on the CCP, but that reported favorably on Taiwan as well, so as to avoid being seen as taking sides. Now, the other 3 broadsheets, Chinese broadsheets in the Philippines at the time, were anti-communist. Right? 2 were, in fact, KMT organs, and another was sort of independently owned and run, but very much sort of pro-ROC, pro-Chiang Kai-shek. Right? So this is sort of the ideological spectrum that we're talking about, right, in the context of the Cold War Philippines, right, in which the most left-wing, quote-unquote, left-wing / liberal newspaper, Chinese newspaper in the Philippines, is in fact a centrist paper, a centrist multiculturalist newspaper. And this is what the KMT, right, could not tolerate, right? Because in the KMT, you need to try to understand things from the KMT's point of view here, right? In the KMT's eyes, right, the Chinese commercial news's centrism was merely cover for its support for communism. This is how KMT stalwarts, this is how the ROC embassy, for example, came to perceive the newspaper. And so the Chinese commercial news affair actually there are 2 phases, there are 2 sort of parts to it, right? In 1962, a whole bunch of people associated with the newspaper, including the publisher and editor, are arrested by the Philippine military and put on trial before the deportation board. They're accused of sort of publishing sort of seditious pro-communist articles. There's a long and complicated trial, the long and complicated set of hearings before the deportation board, and to cut a long story short, the paper is found guilty, right? Even though the evidence against it is very thin and in many cases fabricated by the KMT, they're found guilty, but they're put on probation, right? The publisher and the editor, Quintin and Rizal Yutong, are put on probation for 5 years. And so they're not deported to Taiwan. And so I talk about this. The first part of chapter 7. I talk about how the KMT went out of its way to try to implicate them by downright fabricating evidence of their ties to the CCP. But in 1970, what happens is that the KMT sort of steps up, or just prior to 1970, right? The KMT sort of steps up its efforts to destroy the newspaper, right? This is because having failed to get the Yuzhong brothers, the publisher editor of the CCN, having failed to get them deported in 1962, the KMT tries again in 1969, and this time it's successful because the Ferdinand Marcos administration in the Philippines is actually willing to issue the deportation order. Marcos himself issued the deportation order in early May 1970, and so the brothers end up, despite having been born in the Philippines, right, are deported to Taiwan, where there's a military show trial, and they're sentenced to 2 to 3 years in what is called reformatory education, right? And then so in 1973, one of the brothers is released from this reformatory education in 1972, another was released in 1973, and that's when the saga, right, sort of actually comes to an end. So it's a great story. It's a story that many Filipino Chinese of a certain generation are familiar with, but which really hasn't been sort of documented and researched in great detail previously. It illustrates the extent to which the KMT had insinuated itself into Filipino Chinese society. It illustrates the kinds of connections that existed between the Philippine KMT and the KMT in Taiwan. It demonstrates the extent of collaboration between the Philippine military intelligence on the one hand, Philippine military intelligence, the ROC diplomatic apparatus, and sort of the transnational KMT, the extreme sort of right-wing ideologues who sort of moved between the Philippines and Taiwan as sort of members of the KMT, right? And it also sort of touches on questions of sort of identity as well. It goes to show that one of the reasons why the KMT acted against the Yutong brothers was because their newspaper had been a constant advocate for cultural assimilation into the Philippine nation state, right? They were in favor of Filipino Chinese losing sort of the so-called Chinese aspects of their identity in ways that would have made it more difficult in the longer term for the KMT to mobilize the Filipino Chinese, right? Given that this mobilization was grounded in certain sort of constructed notions of Chinese identity, right? And this idea that the Chinese overseas ought to be fundamentally loyal to their so-called homeland, a homeland that Taipei thought of itself as representing.
In the conclusion, you describe how in 3 short years from 1972 to 1975, the Philippines under Marcos went from sharing sovereignty over the Philippine Chinese with the ROC to establishing ties with the PRC and facilitating the integration of Philippine Chinese into mainstream Filipino society. Now, why did Marcos do this, and how did the Philippine Chinese respond to these changes?
Right. So things actually unraveled pretty quickly for the KMT after the Yutong affair, right? What seems the Yutong affair sort of seems to represent the high watermark, right, of sort of KMT influence and power in the Philippines. But in the years that follow, the KMT hegemony actually unravels pretty quickly, right? The sharing of sovereignty that I talk about between the KMT, ROC on the one hand, and the Philippine state on the other, disintegrates. And much of this I think owes to developments to sort of Philippine political developments, global geopolitics as well during that period. This, of course, is a period that begins with the normalization of U.S. PRC relations, right, and the admission of the People's Republic of China into the United Nations. And this is what gets the ball rolling, right? This is what I think sort of gets the ball rolling for the Philippines, which obviously, as you know, is a key ally of the United States in this part of the world. Marcos declares martial law, right, in September 1972, right, about 50 years ago, and Marcos decides that he is going to normalize relations between the Philippines and the People's Republic of China. There are a whole bunch of reasons for this. Economic reasons, for example, are significant because there was oil in recently discovered oil deposits of oil in China that Marcos that the Philippines was hoping to tap into. At the time, there was the hope that opening relations with China would sort of end the China's rhetorical support for the Communist Party of the Philippines, right, which was a Maoist organization, right? And so so Marcos decides that in order to normalize relations with China, he has to sort of untangle the questions concerning the Chinese community in the Philippines itself. In particular, the question surrounding citizenship. So up until 1972, it's obtaining Filipino, if you were if you were a non-Filipino citizen, let's say you were you held, say, a ROC passport, right, as most Chinese in the Philippines at the time did, right, and you wanted to become a naturalized Philippine citizen, this is possible, but it was a highly expensive and cumbersome procedure that relatively few Filipino Chinese undertook, and which, if you did undertake, you typically sort of bypassed by simply bribing the people involved. So what Marcos does in order to, as part of restoring, as part of establishing diplomatic relations between China and the Philippines, Marcos decides that he will make it he will simplify the naturalization process and enable Chinese Filipinos to embrace sort of Filipino citizenship. And so by this point in the 1970s, a sort of a younger generation of Chinese Filipinos had emerged, a generation that did not have any sort of sentimental or effective, attachments to China, right, or whatever that meant, right, to China or to Taiwan, right. They hadn't been born there. They had grown up in the Philippines. They had grown up, speaking not only Hokkien, right, but were conversant in Filipino languages as well. And so by that point in time, it became Marcos was actually quite deliberate and careful in deciding when it came to sort of restoring relations with China and simplifying the naturalization process. Marcos recognized that this was not going to be that it was, that support for China and attachment to China was no longer really a thing. And that explains his decision to simplify the naturalization process so as to say expedite assimilation, right? Expedite integration into the Filipino nation state. Another thing that Marcos did was to nationalize all Chinese schools and to sort of more or less do away with sort of Chinese language education in the Philippines, right? As a way of spurring assimilation / integration. And all that was meant to sort of limit, right, what any potential fallout from the decision to recognize the People's Republic of China, right? So we will be diplomatic. We will recognize you diplomatically, but we will also take measures to ensure that our persons of ethnic Chinese background in the Philippines will not perceive themselves, and increasingly will perceive themselves less and less as Chinese, as opposed to Filipino. So Marcos sends Imelda, right, to China as sort of his personal representative to sort of get a feel for things. And in 1975, shortly after he's officially simplified the naturalization procedures for all Filipinos, but obviously targeting Chinese Filipinos specifically, Marcos establishes official diplomatic relations between the Philippines and China. And this is all taking place during martial law, right? And all and Marcos is able to issue presidential decrees to get these measures passed without going through Parliament. And for that reason, unfortunately, not because of the diplomatic dimensions of this, but more because of naturalization. The naturalization, right? There are quite a few older Chinese Filipinos who have fairly favorable perceptions of martial law, which is unfortunate, right? Which is because given and there's this perception among many older Chinese Filipinos that martial law was a net positive for the community. The community doesn't sort of switch allegiances overnight from sort of the KMT to the PRC. All loyalties die hard, and what it does mean is that the pro PRC faction within the leading Chinese Chamber of Commerce, for example, is able to actually speak publicly without fear of persecution. There's a power struggle, right, within this organization, the Federation of Filipino Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and these tensions sort of continue to roil the community when the chamber makes its first visit to the PRC in 1994, right? So this is way after, this is almost 2 decades, right, from the normalization of diplomatic relations. They also make a trip right after visiting China to Taiwan, as if to sort of affirm their supposed neutrality in all of this. And so that's what happens. The community as a whole, I think, gradually shifts towards the PRC, but there are a number of diehards, obviously, who refuse to accept what they consider to be Manila's betrayal of its longstanding friendship with Taipei. Right, and I sort of talk about some of these diehards in the final chapter of the book. As mentioned earlier, I really would like to see someone expand on this period, right, and talk about and use primary sources to sort of figure out the kinds of the fallout, right, from Marcos's decision to normalize relations.